Evening, everyone, and thank you very much for coming along tonight. And as you know, we have Alex Ely, and this might be the first in a series of talks of architects who are practicing at the moment, but who have their roots in somewhere in the modern movement and in social engagement. I think Alex's work is probably a good example of that. But anyway, and we'll be looking for more. And I was going to mention this at the end, but we are putting together a program for autumn and winter next year. And we would be very much welcome people to come forward if they have proposals, ideas of the sort of things that they'd like to see, and engage and contribute. That would be really great. Anyway, I shall hand over very quickly to Emma Dent-Code, one of our lovely trustees, who was a contemporary of Alex at the RCA, I think, and we'll do the intro.
Thank you very much, Rob. So lovely to see a full house. We've been advertising like mad. That's brilliant. And I'm so glad I had to persuade Alex a bit, because we were indeed at the Royal College. I was doing my research degree. The first time I failed to get my PhD was at the Royal College. And that's where we met. And Paul, who's lurking at the back there. And we've remained in contact, especially me and Alex, because we're very much like-minded souls. And indeed, Paul. And there's many of us who are interested in that period of social housing and social interaction and damn good architecture, which is what we've got. And I've been following Alex's career for many years now. We won't talk about that, how long ago it was, but we have remained in contact. And the best project he never got, which I was pitching for as much as I could as a local councillor. You know, I was a local councillor, still am, in Kensington, Chelsea, God help me. And member of parliament for a bit, the first member of parliament for the modern movement, as I kept telling people. They have never had an architect in the House of Commons, so it's down to one of you. I always say that because we need people who actually understand how buildings stand up. And when I was there were only 3 people, 2 firemen and somebody who'd been a planner who knew what had happened at Grenfell. They were the only people, apart from me, who had a clue what had happened and understood what had happened. So there was a site in front of Trellick Tower where there was a Goldfinger-designed old people's home, which they decided, for a bunch of lies, because they do lie a lot in our council, that it wasn't fit for purpose, and it had actually been designed to be fit for purpose forever and very flexible. But they knocked it down after I chained myself to the gates and all the appropriate things that politicians do, and they cleared the site. And one of the people who pitched was Alex. And the things that he was saying, I was actually on the selection panel, so it was a bit awkward. I had to say, actually, I was at uni with him, but that was okay. Anyway, it was set up and Alex didn't get it, and he would have done so much better job. And the architect, the practice who took over, have been knocked back endlessly because it didn't work for people. So I think we've had 3 schemes. And after, how many years is it? 15 years, is it? Possibly 15 years, it's still a coach park, which is shocking, in front of Trellick Tower. So, yeah, and we have had big solid towers in the area, and one of them sadly gone. But I'm going to hand over to Alex, who I know is definitely one of us, and it's nice to have a younger generation-ish. Yeah. Youngish generation. Yeah. And over to Alex. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you. Emma, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Yeah, I'm not feeling so much the younger generation anymore. And Tony was just asking me how long we've been set up, and we actually set up 24 years ago, coming up to our 25th anniversary next year. So I've got a lot to talk about, but hopefully it'll play into the relevance of Docomomo. Emma asked me to talk about the continuity of modernism in our work, and slightly sort of jarred with me, not because I don't care and believe in the sort of modern movement, but I've never sort of labelled our work as such, so I gave it a slightly more pompous title of the dialectic between modernism and tradition in our work. And I suppose that would suggest that there are opposing forces at play in our work. And often I'm troubled by this sort of false narrative that divides traditional and modern architecture. We know how that plays out politically and in the press. And I hope you might see that our work is a bit more nuanced and finds a space in between. as soon as we kind of create false dichotomies, it limits our ability to create meaningful solutions for our time. And the real opportunity I see today is about creating and finding architecture that lies in the space in between, creating a synthesis between contemporary needs such as climate emergency, social inequality that Emma mentioned in her introduction, but also honouring the best that went before us. So I'm going to sort of introduce how some lines and streams of modernism influenced our work. It's for you to kind of see the parallels. I'm not going to draw direct equivalence, but hopefully it'll be evident, the links. Sometimes literally, sometimes more alluded to. And forgive me for those who are much more academic and knowledgeable about modernism, but my interpretation spans from 1910 through to the 60s. So certainly late modernism included in this talk. I'm going to start at the large scale, city planning. We were invited by the National Infrastructure Commission to look at the challenges of growing the Oxford to Cambridge corridor a few years back. And the world population we know is growing by 83 million each year. By 2050, it's projected to be that 68% of our world's population will live in urban areas. And it's an additional 2.5 billion people living in cities by 2050. So for me, it's very much a century of the city. And cities, in many ways, are best placed to deal with the climate emergency, being more efficient in their land use, being more compact in their form factor, and being more lower carbon in their transport needs. And the modernists, in fact, even before sort of modern movement, architects have always been fascinated by the idea of shaping cities. New concepts like Edinburgh Newtown, Ebenezer Howard's Garden Cities, or Le Corbusier's Ville Contemporaine, or Plan Voisin, seek to imagine a better future, but often by disconnecting us from the past. Many of these images are shaped by, in an image of a state, a sort of top-down system of governance and order, segregating function into rigid urban forms. And yet, by contrast, organic cities like Florence, even London here, are actually more an imprint of collective behaviour than the work of master planners and architects. And for us, cities are living organisms. They're not machines. They are shaped both by top-down forces, such as zoning laws, planning commissions, but also bottom-up forces that create distinct neighbourhoods and unplanned demographic clusters. So when we've had the privilege of kind of thinking about big city planning, we need to recognise that communities self-organise. And by synthesising a sort of century of urban theory with modern sustainability imperatives, we can create frameworks that both address that sort of structured idea of big city ideas, but also that can adapt and evolve to kind of the community needs over time and socially transform. So back to sort of modernist thinking, I want to start with a reference from 1947. Frederick Gibberd's master plan for Harlow Newtown. It represented a synthesis of Englishness and modernity. It combined radical ideas about collective living and local vernacular to form a distinctive civic modernity. And it was described as exemplifying a form of modern planning in which social betterment was secured through the creation of aesthetically pleasing, rationally ordered townscape. But it had its critics. Gordon Cullen dismissed it as prairie planning. And it failed in some respects, in terms of the employment goals never being met, industry wasn't interested in locating there, and there are criticisms of the green wedges creating segregated suburban estates. And often those green spaces in between, illustrated perhaps best on the top right, were considered functionless green spaces. But nonetheless, I think it's a really interesting diagram that isn't as diagrammatic or prescriptive perhaps as Corbusier's or even Ebenezer Howe's model, but actually more reflective of the setting, the context, and the landscape. And so I think there's a kernel of an idea that we saw in this that we wanted to take forward. So when we were invited by the National Infrastructure Commission to look at the Oxford-Cambridge Arcs, it's a neighbourhood, or it's a region rather, that's estimated to grow by 1.9 million people over the next 34 years. And we need to ask big questions about how we accommodate that. Is that going to be more endless kind of volume house builder sprawl? And do we have the capacity or even the carbon budget to accommodate that? Or do we look at new compressed, condensed, compact, dense, vibrant urban settlements? So this diagram starts to show an idea of a series of city nodes that gradually over time grow and are connected. And it effectively, each node combines both the employment access, the housing need, the civic infrastructure, but also is connected by transport into infrastructure. And it forms over time like a constellation of stars and forming a network. It lies at the intersection between HS2, this line, and the Oxford to Cambridge railway line. And it was seen as a sort of ideal junction where good transport infrastructure actually extends the economic growth of this new town out to a much wider region. And so by linking up with HS2 and other transport, this scheme can become part of an ecosystem that integrates London, Birmingham, Manchester, and Leeds, forming a dynamic region where goods, knowledge, and people flow easily between urban centres. The model, as we see it, is about not a rigid master plan, but actually a spatial framework that can adapt and flourish over time. It's a city that is a living system. It's always growing, it's always changing, but essentially the kind of principles of development, its essential character, is established through this framework. Now, the framework looks very kind of specific to the setting, but underlying each of these nodes is a set of principles around walkable neighbourhoods, about diversity, about connections with nature. It's a city that thrives on interconnection and diversity. Each node integrates residential, technological, social, and civic buildings. And each can be programmed. Perhaps one's more about education and knowledge. Another one might be more about science and healthcare. But nonetheless, each can kind of feed off that infrastructure and that network that Oxford to Cambridge Knowledge Quarter embodies. And between the nodes, it's a working landscape. It's not just an aesthetic landscape that divides suburban communities, but it's a working landscape that provides for these new neighbourhoods. And each neighbourhood is of an ambitious and specific density. Each is walkable, so it's a 1 kilometre squared neighbourhood ranging from 50 up to 200 dwellings per hectare. But nonetheless, each can have its own sort of character and individuality. So the node forms a campus that has a clear border, clear boundary bond, which is landscape. And each node can accommodate between 5,000 and 25,000 people. So each is a miniature town in itself, or neighbourhood. Now, the inspiration isn't only entirely Frederick Gibberd, but also historical parallels like the Roman settlement of Silchester. Here, I mean, suggests a very literal diagrammatic interpretation, the walled city being a sort of almost octagonal form. But the principle behind Silchester was not to create a garden city, but to insert urban features in the countryside. It is a city in itself, and that was very much our thinking for the previous scheme. Within the sort of defined outer edges, the infrastructure by way of the road network is defined, the urban centre is defined, but actually buildings can loosely and organically congregate along those access routes and develop and respond to the needs as they change. So moving from The city, and we often don't get those sort of opportunities to think that big, so that was kind of a bit of a one-off, I have to say, even though with the New Towns programme, I'm always trying to push that opportunity to stay involved in that. More typically, we're working at a neighbourhood level, and I want to go back to the 1910 to 1930 period and start with the Berlin modernist housing estates, which testify to innovative housing policies from 1910 to 1933 during the Weimar Republic. It's a period when the city of Berlin was particularly progressive socially, politically, culturally, and the estates, and I think there are now 11 UNESCO-listed estates, are examples of a building reform movement that contributed by improving housing, living conditions for people with low incomes, often through novel approaches to town planning, to architecture, and to the garden design. And they've proved exceptional examples of urban and architectural typologies. They still feel fresh and engaging places today. Bruno Taut, Martin Wagner, Walter Gropius, all involved as architects for some of these schemes and many others. And this particular example here, which you see me in the photo, I'm actually still wearing the same jacket even though the photo was taken about 10 years ago. This was for the BD's Building Design's inspiration piece. It's the Brits Metropolitan Development in Berlin, which I chose as my inspiration. And that's when the press had budgets to fly you to a nice building or place to be photographed in and then write an article about. You see from the plan on the right, it has a very conspicuous and dominant horseshoe apartment building, which is shown on the left, that surrounds and embraces a park, but then also a series of parallel terraces run out from that crescent in the form of terrace housing with shared gardens, interestingly. So here you see the park, but also you see the simplicity of 2,000 dwellings with standardized floor plans, standard living rooms, bedrooms, bathrooms, and kitchens. But in order to avoid the monotony, they took on different character in terms of color, materiality, but also you start to see where they turn corners or where the terrace terminates, a building of slightly different character or scale adds legibility and improves the character, the wayfinding, the sense of place. Very simply and economically designed, but for me, kind of rich in character and placemaking. And I mean, the extraordinary thing today, now the landscaping has matured and it just feels very much, the landscape feels very much part of the neighborhood and the place. Another example is Siemensstadt and also Charlottenburg Nord. Much bigger scheme, 18,000 homes, master planned by Hans Schroom. And it followed the principles of neighborhood units. It's loosely related to Bruno Taut's concept of outside living space. It preserves the landscape and opens it up to surrounding gardens. So at Charlottenburg Nord, which is actually the area to the south, on the bottom of the plan on the right, is actually the bit I'm more interested in, which is breaks the kind of regular sort of repetition of straight parallel blocks, and by cranking the blocks, envelops space, encloses gardens, as well as creating more diversity and a more livable, a more humane scale of development. So Hans Schroon led this, but also architects like Walter Gropius, Hugo Häring, Otto Barning, all contributed and helped shape the architecture of this place. But I like the kind of open-ended nature of these urban blocks, the fact that they don't follow the kind of classic pattern of perimeter blocks that you see so conspicuously almost in every housing scheme today, the donut perimeter block, which shuts off daylight into the courtyard space. It reduces aspect and also denies passers-by the kind of privilege of being able to see into those garden spaces. So it was a source of inspiration when we were designing this scheme, which I'm pleased to say got planning approval last week after 4 years of working very closely with the residents on the White City Central Estate in Hammersmith and Fulham. It sits in the centre of this kind of wonderful estate that was built interwar, which you start seeing, you can just see out of view, but it does have these linear tenement blocks that run north-south. And in the middle of the estate is a large underused area where there's potential here for 250 homes, a new nursery, a new community centre. And our approach here is to create linear blocks that allow kind of views through. The loose geometry encloses gardens for the residents in between, but doesn't deny anyone access. It's not about creating levels of privilege or ghettos. It's giving equal access, but equally offering a sense of place by using geometry and simple kind of enclosure to define legible open space. So just to explain the scheme, we've got 6 residential blocks running parallel, and then that's the community centre, top left is the nursery, and then there's a public route that runs through it, Bridget Joyce Square, and it's a largely pedestrianised neighbourhood. A huge amount of green trees. Again, the cranks in the plan were designed to protect and keep as many as possible. Just zooming in on the longest block, just to talk you through the plan and how that works. It's in clusters, so in this case it's got 3 cores, so that allows us to avoid the sort of continuous long double-loaded corridor. It means that every point here you get a through flat, so promoting dual aspect. And then also by cranking the footprint at the end, it also allows us to increase the number of dual aspect flats. So it creates that kind of happy medium between efficiency and good net to gross that so many clients now demand, while still promoting good aspect, good daylight, and good cross ventilation. And then just a bay study on the top that shows the sort of emerging architectural expressions, simple brick architecture with, in this case, detached balconies that are self-supporting to reduce thermal bridging and improve the thermal efficiency of the architecture. And it's something that we're always kind of mindful of, is that sort of balance between efficiency, reducing our carbon impact, and improving the sort of accommodation for people's quality of life and well-being. So these are the sort of studies that we do or did for this project to compare the characteristics of a deck access block on the left, a double loaded corridor, second to left, and then on the far right side, our cranked block, which for us creates a happy medium between efficiency in terms of number of homes per floor, form factor, which helps reduce heat losses, and good carbon efficiency, so 0.86, which not as good as a double-loaded corridor, but actually not bad. But what it does achieve, much better than a double-loaded arrangement, is dual aspect. So it's sort of 70 to, I can't see from this angle, 70 to 80% dual aspect, compared with probably 15 to 30% in a double-loaded block. And here you see visuals of the architectural character on the right, the public spaces in between, the cranked volumes at the end, adding a sort of dynamic to the public spaces, adding character and richness to the architecture, to what is otherwise fairly simple and economic buildings, low-cost social housing, and then on the left you see the gable of the community centre. So moving on, I want to touch on repairing modernism, which is increasingly a priority these days. Hillington Square was a classic postmodern estate, and it replaced the Victorian slums that you see here. It was built to provide housing for London overspill between 1967 to 71, and its typical slab blocks, all connected by an elevated street in the sky. In fact, 300 homes, just 2 lift cores at either end of the estate, Otherwise, all of the homes were connected by one single walkway. And we were invited in 2013 to consider retrofit, working with the community who still valued the homes, but actually they were in very poor condition, which you will start seeing here. Le Corbusier dismissed the street as a dislocated organ that can no longer function. It was the sort of thinking that drove that idea of putting garages all at ground and killing off the public realm because there's no footfall, there's no activation, there's no sort of oversight of those spaces. It was poorly maintained, it feels unsafe and uncomfortable. But nonetheless, we kind of thought it deserved a second life and shouldn't be demolished. And actually, we were interested in reimagining some of the sort of modernist problems, but also valuing the sort of idealism of its modern precedent. So what we did was really give those buildings a second life by doing selective demolition, here in this case taking out one block that then opened up a connection to the main town, thermal upgrades, improving the kind of look and feel of the homes, improving the public realm. There's me again looking like Kevin MacLeod, admiring the architecture. And the new architecture is sort of applied without ambiguity. You very clearly see the changes overlaid and grafted onto the historic architecture. And here, notably, you see the ground floor garages are now activated. They become front doors, new cores to the buildings above. In fact, every other garage becomes a bike and bin store, and then the alternative garage actually becomes an entrance to a flat behind, which we introduced. So more small gains trying to overcome some of the sort of urban problems of modernism, or at least this kind of modernism. And here, just to illustrate the point, the scheme had bedsits at ground. By converting that garage into a new entrance storage, it both extends and enhances that home. It gives them a new front door onto the street, and then the block itself has new cores which give it an address and give it identity and character. Now, at the same time that Hillingdon Square was being built, an alternative approach to sort of modernist thinking of estate design was being developed at the London Borough of Camden. You'll be well aware of developments like Alexandra Road, designed by Neve Brown in 1967, so the same time that Hillingdon Square was built. He was working for Sidney Cook and really adopting the heroic kind of manner of the modern masters, but also recognising the urban syntax of terraces, of streets, of squares, derived from London urban traditions of the 18th and 19th century. And this project realised Brown's ambition to make a piece of city that was unmistakably modern, but also connecting with the cultural inheritance of the surrounding city. Other notable projects of the era, Cook's Fleet Road, of Cook's era, is Fleet Road by Neve Brown again, conceived as a building on the idea of a terrace house built in the 18th, 19th century, but also with identifiable own front doors to the street, paved gardens, fencing for privacy and so on. And then on the right, Branch Hill, which was amongst other projects inspired by Siedlung Harlan, Atelier 5's kind of wonderful housing scheme. And in this case, Alan Forsyth describes it as being 19th century urbanism, modernism, and selective traditional models reconfigured but not copied. So a more humane scale modernism, before even Sidney Cook's era at Camden, had already been explored by, once again, Frederick Gibberd in 1948. He was appointed by the London Borough of St Pancras to redesign the Regent's Park estate. The council had lost confidence in its own initial plan of endlessly repetitive slab blocks. So Gibberd redeveloped what had been bombed on the left from 1890 into the master plan on the right, and it introduced a variety of human scale spaces and a variety of types. And alongside Frederick Gibberd, architects like Armstrong McManus were working on schemes where even the likes of Jeremy Dixon, Edward Jones were working in that office from 65 to 71. So here we see Gibberd's work on the left and Armstrong McManus's work on the right. And this became the context for our project, which was to provide new housing for residents who are about to lose their home or be displaced by HS2 construction. So we needed to find sites within their vicinity so they could stay in the neighbourhood for new development. And I'll just touch on 3 of the buildings, which we see as being like dental surgery. They kind of repair some of the broken urban grain. So the first one is Kentmere, and it sits at the corner of Redhill. It's a U-shape, which sort of creates the fourth corner in a U-shaped block, but stands apart from it. It remains independent and gives the original modernist block its own independence. And here you just see how it harmonises in terms of its brick with the neighbouring architecture, but also through its kind of grand scale, double scaled balconies, again, responds to some of the geometry and form making of its neighbour, and then stepping down to the Victorian architecture to the north, which you see here. The other block, Robert Street, or Kirkfell, which is on Robert Street, is a simple rectangular building that creates a continuous loggia on the outside. It's stacked duplexes with a community centre on the ground. And here you see a glimpse through to the McManus and Armstrong McManus building with its stacked duplexes. But also on the right, you see the horizontal banding of the walkway architecture on the left, echoed and mirrored, in this case, by the balconies of our architecture on the right, which becomes more explicit in this view, where we have sort of piano nobile, so playing with scale and hierarchy as well. And then a sense of the sort of balconies and quality of space. So really kind of imagining gallery access architecture in a more convivial way to some of the sort of 60s precedents. And then the third block, Cowdale, again, sort of makes reference in passing to Gibberd's work. Gibberd's buildings have this checkerboard facade, and we pick it up more loosely in the composition of this building that turns the corner on one of the building plots. And internally, you get, in fact, this has 1 flat per floor in the apartment block and then a little terrace of 3 houses. But we arrange the rooms on enfilade, so kitchen, living, dining has transparent and glazed connection to the living room, which then connects to a similarly sized and scaled outdoor space, which for us, we were kind of looking again at the likes of Neve Brown at Alexandra Road, where you get this lovely arrangement of almost 3 equally sized living spaces, the kitchen diner, the living space in the middle on the right-hand plan, and then a generous outdoor terrace that, again, feels like an outdoor room. And these beautiful models were produced by some of our students at Unit 5 at the London Met, and some here tonight. So next sort of area of exploration is the section. And so much housing today is just about the plan. It stacks them up in a sort of uniform way. And yet what I love about so much modernism is its interest and focus on the section. Agar Grove was built in 1962, or rather approved in 1962, designed by Austin Smith Partners, which at the time Mike Austin Smith was president of the Architectural Association. The practice subsequently was renamed Austin Smith Salmon Lord, and the scheme was completed in 1966. Actually, just before St Pancras Borough became the London Borough of Camden, and when sort of Sidney Cook's era at Camden took over. So it wasn't part of his commissioning because it was a different borough at the time. But, and as a result, I think it's not recognised, certainly, of being the same quality and standard. And indeed, that's what the residents felt, because they voted overwhelmingly for redevelopment. David Grandorge's photos sort of reveal here the Lulworth Tower on the right, which will be refurbished, but it also shows its very problematic relationship to the ground floor. Bin stores, car park, no dignity for those arriving to their home. And then even on the left with the low-rise buildings, again, no access to the green spaces. Ground floor apartments have no direct outdoor space. and so a missed opportunity. And yet it faces, right across the road, a conservation area of very beautiful, elegant Victorian villas. In fact, David Chipperfield's first office is just tucked away between these buildings here. But you can see on the left, the estate really turned its back on its neighbourhood. So we were appointed alongside our partners Hawkins Brown and Grant Associates to develop a master plan. And really it's a sort of scheme that is not about abstract geometry, but about responding to the urban grain, to patterns of daily life, to solar orientation, to social connection. It balances good solar gain for its passive house performance, but also layouts that support good streetscape and an urban response. So I'm just going to flick through some of the houses. It's a huge diversity of houses, partly because we were having to respond to a very specific need of returning residents. Every resident on this estate got rehoused or was offered a house on the estate again, a brand new house to passive house standard, to much higher space standards as well, to modern London housing design standards. And so this is phase 2, which we designed, and it's got 4 different types of development, which I'll just talk you through. While this is up, they just sort of show the ground floor plan, because although the ground floor dwellings all have their own private amenity, they all access directly onto a shared garden, which is secure for those residents within that development. And overall, it's 50% affordable housing, and every tenure shares access and equal access to those shared garden spaces. So along Agar Grove, we have villas that pick up the rhythm and pattern of a Victorian building opposite, offering cultural continuity. The streetscape, you can see, is activated through front doors and dwellings that have direct relationship to the street. So there's a choreography of entrance sequences, front gardens, active ground floors, creating natural surveillance, but also opportunity for neighbourly interaction, as well as environmental engagement with its kind of soft green borders. And then in section, we have a level of complexity here. We've got a triplex above a duplex in this instance. So in the duplex, you come in at ground with bedrooms above, and in the triplex, you come in off a walkway at 3rd floor, and you come into your living space or kitchen dining space, and you either go up to a living space or down to your bedrooms. And then you get these wonderful connected internal spaces with light, both through the depth of a plan, but also light from above as well. So every opportunity to give a sense of extension and growth of the space, even though it's designed to efficient and compact space standards. And then here you see the ground floor garden and the shared garden between. Here on the south side of the development, we have 2 levels of stacked maisonettes. So ground floor maisonettes, again, accessed off the street, and then the maisonette above, which looks like a sort of cyclops sitting on the roof, is accessed through a gallery around the back. But actually it's designed to kind of feel more like a terrace of houses rather than stacked kind of 60s stacked maisonettes. So here you see a duplex above a duplex. And again, exploring the idea of the enfilade of rooms. Here you've got a living dining space, could be a living space, kitchen in the middle, living space at the back, and then a patio at the back. So again, flexibility to allow residents to determine how they wish to use those spaces. And here you see those connected rooms. And then the third type, which probably pulls us back to the sort of modern movement most specifically, is our explorations of split-level duplex apartments, which in this case don't have the visible sectional complexity of Neve Brown or Benson Forsyth, because we have things like Cold Bridges that we take account of now. But nonetheless, it's designed to feel like a simple mansion block, but actually the gable starts to give away clues of the complexity of the section inside. And then at the other end of the bookend is a sort of complementary block. And so internally, you get this section on the right, which has double height space for the ground floor dwelling in purple, and then it's got three split level duplexes above. which might become a bit more clearer in the next section. And the beauty of split level living is, it gives a spatial generosity to the homes which are otherwise minimum space standards. You come in and you either get a view up to the sky if you're ascending, or down to the gardens if you're descending. And it kind of creates this wonderful dynamic space internally, which you see here, a real sense of delight and quality of life, and also allowing flexibility about how those different levels are used. So undoubtedly at the back of our mind is the work of Sidney Cook and his era. It's also been designed to passive house, which I probably haven't got time to go into now, but good environmental performance, energy efficiency, air tightness, thermal insulation, and good daylight sunlight, so naturally cross-ventilated. So each apartment is accessed off a gallery at the back, but then the alternative gallery is actually just the means of escape, and it is private. So the bedrooms on that level only look onto a private gallery, so you don't have that conflict that you often get in modern housing of bedrooms onto walkways. But another obvious parallel is the work of Darbon and Dark, who I've been a long admirer of. And they worked through the 60s and 70s, developing a kind of public housing that restates particular English virtues of domestic architecture. Often at the time, councils were focused on system-build housing, whereas Darbon and Dark quietly proved that some of the essentials of domestic life, like privacy, small gardens, good landscaping, can also be achieved at high densities in cities within the sort of framework of vernacular materials. And here you see Lillington Gardens in Pimlico, a wonderfully kind of rich and complex scheme, won in open competition in 61, completed in 72. 200 dwellings per hectare, so good dense scheme that alongside 780 homes has a library, community facilities, shops and gardens. And again, studies by our students at London Met show some of the sort of spatial qualities of a split level arrangement in this scheme. Another scheme, Marquis Road, not so well tended or looked after as Lillington Gardens, but nonetheless some really interesting apartment layouts. So built around the same time, 993 homes, as well as common spaces. But here, Darbon and Dark were exploring the crossover section, not just the split section, but actually interlocking plans, which you perhaps see best in the red and blue diagram. And the principle here was that each home would have its own front door, its own outdoor garden, and through aspect and through ventilation. And living rooms could be lifted off the ground, and also there would be an upper street for those top floor dwellings. And here you get a sense of the sort of convivial nature of the roof street on the right, but also the ground floor condition on the left. So we experimented with crossover apartments on a couple of unrealised projects. And the first one was a proposal for the Liverpool docks. And you can probably see other references, but Tony probably better described these in his James Gowan talks last week. But this was a proposal for an amazing site overlooking the Mersey, and we promoted the idea of these linear blocks that would run along the river, U-shaped blocks behind, and then a sort of mixed-use hotel and community programme to the right. But what's unusual here is that we wanted to afford as many homes as possible an opportunity for an aspect over the Mersey, over the River Mersey. So we designed these interlocking duplexes where you come in either facing away or towards the river, and the ones that are facing away come upstairs and then have their elevated floor overlooking the river. And sort of this gives you a sort of sense of how it would look, and they become lanterns at night, and sort of architecturally quite formally dramatic. Another scheme that also explored the crossover, also unrealised, but for Graham Park, a large master plan which we worked on with Paul, who's joined us. And here we were exploring crossover apartments in the mews that sits in between. And here the thinking was that homes could either be accessed from the garden side or from the street side. So this rather, in fact the next will show the detail, but simple apartment blocks on the outside in yellow, green and red, but then the blue and purple starts to reveal the complexity of the section of these dwellings, which again was about creating spatial diversity, helping activate both the street side and the garden side, and creating generous 3-story family homes. Okay, so last 5-10 minutes, I just want to move on to the plan and section. Now, Tony trailed this project to his talk on James Gowan, so I'll bring it up again, and I know he made reference to our use of this project in our work. Brunswick Park School in Camberwell by Sterling and Gowan in '61. It was commissioned by the London County Council, and it's a simple building. It's school, dining hall and assembly hall, designed to be flexible. And it's 4 wedges that pinwheel around, one with a flat roof, and 3 wedges, and then the fourth side is a flat roof. And it draws on Sterling's early work at Churchill, Sterling Gowan's earlier work at Churchill College, as well as Walton Park House. And it was described as an island of green lawns and open space, and it was very much about creating a contrast to the architectural chaos around. And internally, you get these wedge-shaped spaces with the supported or propped beam for the roof. And you'll see this as a reference, shamelessly pinched. I guess it's called plagiarism in our Sandsend Arts and Community Centre, which sits in Fulham. It's a community building, and were shortlisted for Sterling Prize a couple of years back. And here you see, again, wedges, but not pinwheeled. This is much more integrated into the landscape. So the wedges sit in parallel, 2 to the north, 2 to the east, and on the one side they frame a threshold or public space that gives access from the street and through the Victorian Garden Wall, and then on the other side they enclose a small private terrace that then opens onto South Park. And then Clancarty Lodge, seen through the pictures of a roof, was refurbished and retained. And here you see very literally the sort of parallel with one of my heroes. So in this case being used for a dance hall, but there's a wonderful kind of mix of programs going on here. It's cross-laminated timber in construction, so it's super low carbon architecture, low carbon in its embodied carbon, but also operational, so it's designed to be as passively cooled and heated as possible. There's no added skirting board, no plasterboard, no architraves, none of the sort of additional finishes that we typically add to buildings that only add carbon and not necessarily adding value. And here you see the flexibility of connection between the main hall and the cafe, and then the sort of cafe on the right with its top light and clear story window, which allows cross ventilation and balanced light throughout. And then gradually over time, it's emerging and disappearing into its landscape setting. And here on the left, you see the outdoor terrace for the cafe. So just quickly a plan. The 2 volumes, slightly loose geometry, just to open it up to the park. So visitors come through here, they can meet and gather if there's a reception that they're meeting. And they can either, if they're visitors, they might just go straight through to the park, or they can peel off into the main hall, into the cafe, or into the ancillary spaces. And here you see the architecture. The soft yellow brick is made from waste. It's an upcycled product, so reducing about 28 tons of material that would otherwise gone into landfill, reducing the carbon, and now increasingly becoming more prevalent. We're starting to see more and more made from waste materials. And here you see the timber shades to the clear story glazing, which helps provide shading in low angle sun. And then the park beyond, which is kind of wonderfully kind of rich landscape, and it sort of nestles into its setting. And retaining the garden wall, which used to be a sort of private house, and then was gifted by its owner. Initially, it was leased as a nursery and then gifted to the council as a park. And then here you see the inside spaces. So my last reference is Salo Town Hall in Finland, built between 1949 and 51. You all know this one, Alvar Aalto. And he references the traditional European court and tower typology as the basis of civic architecture. The plan creates two contrasting conditions. Here we see the imposing two-story monolithic building in unornamented brick, and the C-shaped plan which encloses this wonderful garden on the raised courtyard side, which is gives access to the library, to the offices, wonderful transparent space, again creating a quiet, protected garden space that's much more intimate in character. Now, I accept that there's always a risk in following an Aalto masterpiece with one of our own buildings, but I've always kind of believed that you need to stand on the shoulders of giants in order to see further and find ways to evolve previous models. And so the John Morden Centre here is our little nod and homage to Alvar Aalto. It's a single-storey building, but by creating these brick pavilions with their big, voluminous, double-storey space, it lends it a certain scale and civic quality. It's not as coherent in terms of its plan as Aalto's town hall, partly because of the constraints of existing trees, of back fences, and the sort of constraints of a site that we had to work with. But nonetheless, there are kind of ideas that I'll talk through that we believe do have clear, legible ideas. And then on the opposite side to the brick pavilions is the garden side, with its cloister that runs through the building from one end to the other and surrounds this beautiful centenary cedar tree, which again provides a space for conviviality and a space for the elderly residents to meet. This is part of an almshouse complex. In fact, I'll just sort of show the next scheme. So Morden College, built in 1695 by Sir John Morden as almshousing, and attributed to Christopher Wren, more likely Edward Strong designed. But it has this wonderful quadrangle that you see here, with the colonnaded ground floor, lively and animated pitched roofs and chimneys, and perhaps better seen in the figure ground plan. So the continuity between that architecture and ours is the borrowing of the colonnade, that in the case of the quadrangle is inward looking and kind of geometrically sort of distinct. Ours kind of meanders and weaves through the building from this end through here to here. And as a result, you get quite a dynamic experience as you walk through, sometimes looking into gardens, sometimes looking into spaces. And then the buildings that you saw earlier, the pavilions, pick up some of the brick pitch roof architecture. It's also cross-laminated timber, and these sort of pyramidal forms so they become a family of elements. So here we've got the health centre, we've got a reception area, offices, shops, art space, restaurant and cafe, and then a theatre space, and the cooking facilities at the back. And it's very much designed for the elderly residents who live in the college, and intended to be a sort of hub, a community hub, where people can live a good life in their later days and really thrive into their old age. We know that anxiety, depression, a lot of illnesses come about through loneliness and isolation. And this is really trying to do the exact opposite. It's trying to create a space where residents can connect, feel supported, develop programs of art, of culture, of events and activities, and support each other. And it's really wonderful. Every time I go, there are different activities going on. But all the spaces connect, and by opening up the art room here to the cafe, people have actively got embraced and got engaged in some of the activities that they wouldn't have otherwise taken part in. So we know it's already had a positive effect on people's welfare. And I think that might be Pilates, I don't know. Okay, just to finish, some views of the interiors, playing the game that Alvar Aalto played in his cafe, the idea of pulling the distant view of the tree into the foreground and pushing the landscape in the foreground to the back. So you get this layered effect of a colonnade through the portals in the cafe. And here you see the colonnade, which also provides areas for respite and seating as you come along your journey. And then some of the active spaces that are being evidently enjoyed. It kind of looks a bit Wes Anderson on the top left. Anyway, right, last point. 100 years ago, as I was asked to talk about links between modernism and our work, Corbusier wrote his manifesto towards an architecture, and his polemical writings promoted a model of living that reflected the spirit of the industrial age. But for me, although it has many ideals in terms of its kind of social ambitions, it also set off a chain of events that created a fragmented society, mono-tenure housing estates, fetishization of concrete, resource-intensive construction, and some of the problems I talked about earlier. So our riposte to that is towards a resilient architecture, which we published a couple of years ago, and it tries to speak about some of the challenges that we face today and some of the ideas that we've invested in our architecture over time, notably about the interconnectedness of social, sustainable, and spatial principles in our work. Thank you.